John Katz, why did you call your book Reality?
It's a little bit of a play off of virtual reality, and I thought it was time to tell the truth about media and culture.
You've got a subhead up there. I'm going to show the audience the cover, and then we can read it as we get closer here. How America Surrendered Discussion of Moral Values to Opportunists, Nitwits, and Blockheads like William Bennett. Why such strong language?
Well, the subtitle was not really my idea, and I have to say I was a little queasy about it. It does reflect my sentiments, I have to say that, but I thought it was a little sharp. But the publisher pointed out to me that this is a way that books get attention and that people notice them. That a lot of media books sort of just sink into the ether. They get a lot of media attention, but the people you're writing about don't read them. And I did want the book to get a wider audience than that. So I knew I was going to catch it as a result of it, and I am. But
why is William Bennett a blockhead?
I think opportunist would apply in his case for me more than blockhead. I think he's not dumb. I think he is making millions of dollars off of the notion that $30 books about hardworking bumblebees are going to help needy kids. And I think he's really reinforced the notion that culture and media are dangerous and are hurting people when they're really not. And as a consequence of that thinking, he's certainly not alone in this. The boomers are in it and journalism is in it. I think we live in a culture in which needy kids get no help and kids who don't need help get too much help.
Inside your book, in the chapter that talks about him, you have this picture or this graphic. What is it?
I'm not sure, but I think it's the king of the mediophobes. Was his honorific in the book. I advanced in the book the idea that this fear about media and culture has created a climate I call mediophobia, in which people are terrified about the impact of information pouring in on their lives and on their kids. I think Bennett is the modern father of this movement. He began sort of with the NEA fights and during the Reagan. Although he is certainly not alone in it anymore. He is he's a critic of rap. He's a critic of daytime talk shows. He's an advocate of boycotts. And of course, he's sold quite a few books of moral values that are meant as an antidote to this. I think what really lit up this mediaphobic movement was when the cultural conservatives who started it were joined by the boomers. Very nervous about their children. They're very concerned about their kids in general. And were particularly concerned that the information revolution was making it almost impossible to control the information that their kids were seeing. When these groups linked up, I think journalism, boomers, it really became the broadest based political movement in America. It's the one thing Bob Dole and Bill Clinton. Culture was dangerous, television was dangerous. There's a whole culture now of software, V-chips, ratings that are supposed to be an antidote and ward off this sort of evil. And they're not going to work. They're picking people's pockets with this stuff.
Let me ask the obvious question. Why is Bill Bennett an opportunist and you're not?
Well, he's made a lot more money than I have, basically. If I get to the point where I've sold as many books as he has, we'll be equal. I think he's an opportunist. What really bothers me about, I think, Mr. Bennett is I think he's smart enough to know that his books are not helping kids who are in need, because needy kids are not going to fables that he didn't write and has sort of cleaned up. He's now publishing a children's book of virtues calendar for $13, which has 100 virtuous stickers in it. And if the kid is virtuous 101 days, you have to go out and buy more stickers for the calendar. I think this sort of marketing of morality has the impact of really undermining democracy in the name of morality. It convinces people that if you got rid of rap and altered television and made movies cleaner, that we wouldn't have social problems in America. I also think, ironically, that Bennett has undermined what I believe in, and I think is a very conservative motion that I make quite a bit of noise about in Virtuous Reality, which is we need to take more responsibility for our children. We are responsible for the moral lives of our kids, which is essential, I think, a very conservative notion that I embrace very deeply. And yet we live in a culture where everybody's saying, it's not your fault, it's television's fault. If you have a rating system, get a V-chip, buy Cyber Nanny. Everyone is taking responsibility for kids but parents. And I think the only thing that's really going to work, if you read Robert Coles or anybody who writes about the moral conscience of children, is if parents really take responsibility for what their kids are doing. And that's not happening. And if you look at any of the statistics about violence in the young, you see this striking correlation between children having children, between lack of economic opportunity. The urban underclass is really engulfed in this sort of stuff. The suburban middle class, who are the biggest users of new media, are the safest group of kids on the planet. I mean, the crime is not going up. They don't go out and watch Beavis and Butthead and hurt people or get hurt. And I think the idea that these kids are at risk, which is a central tenet that Bennett advances politically apart from his books, he is cashing in on. And I think that the real victims of it are the kids in America who do need help and get none.
In talking about Bill Bennett's book, the last little paragraph in one section, it says, as for my own teenage daughter, I let her browse through a couple of stories, I assume in that book,
Yeah.
and ask her if she wanted me to read them to her. Quote, "You'll have to kill me first," she said. How old is your daughter?
She's now 15. She was 14 at the time.
What is her name?
Emma.
Your only child?
Yes, yes.
And when she said, does that sound like her? You'll have to kill me first?
That's definitely.
Where does that come from?
Well, she's what I call a transcultural kid, and she's a kid. She watches television. She likes the X-Files. She watches Beavis and Butthead occasionally, mostly Friends, maybe. She reads like a fiend. You know, I don't want to be bragging, but she is a straight-A student. I think, understands that there are some things in new culture and media that benefit her, and she loves books and traditional culture as well. She sings in a chorale. She sang The Messiah in Carnegie Hall just a couple of months ago. And I don't claim that I'm representative of all parents or that she's representative of all kids, but it is possible to use a computer, to watch some television, to see some tacky movies, and still be a great student and a great kid and a good person. She's a very moral person. She has a great value system. I'm enormously proud of her. And I think we have this contract that I read about in the book, the contract between parents and kids, that I think is quite rational, that as long as she does as well as she's doing in the world, she does have a lot of freedom to explore culture in the way that she wants. She goes online, and I'm not looking over her shoulder. She can watch whatever TV show she wants, pretty much. And she knows to come to us if there's a problem. If she sees something that disturbs her, she's very sharp about sounding the alarm. So I think the idea of this transcultural child who we stop, you know, we're not doing our kids any favors by calling them stupid, by trashing their culture, by dumping all over the movies they watch. All we're doing is creating this sort of tension and hostility about their lives. I think we do need to have more respect for their culture, even though it's patently offensive in many ways to what we believe.
But why would she say, you'll have to kill me first?
Because she started as preaching right away. And I took this book, by the way, and I went to 3 schools. I didn't just go to her. I went to a school in Paterson, New Jersey, and Montclair, and one in New York City. And I said to the teachers, I'm just reading William Bennett's book. And they said, oh, come on in. They didn't know who I was. They just thought that was great, that William Bennett's stories were going to get read.
Book of Virtues.
The Book of Virtues. And one was about a frog who really wanted to get back to school. One was about a hard-working bumblebee. These kids, looked at me like I was crazy. They just couldn't imagine why I was reading them this. And when I told them it cost $30, they just fell on the floor laughing. They said, "You paid $30 for that?" And it was interesting to me because I did want to try it out. I did give it a sort of fair shot with a bunch of kids, and I have shown it to kids I know in other contexts. And I thought the idea that this book is really what kids need to become moral. I mean, they may be perfectly good stories to read to small kids. I don't mean to take this so far into hyperbole. But this is not an issue this is nothing that's going to help needy children in America. It doesn't help kids who are in need. And kids like my daughter certainly don't need it. And the only people who can afford it are people like myself, who are the only people who would spend $30. So I spent a couple of afternoons, one in a Barnes & Noble, one in a Borders, watching people buy the book. And I would sort of go up to them and say, I'm working on a book about this stuff, and can you tell me, why are you buying this book? They were grandparents, and they were boomers. It completely shocked me. They were boomers, and they were thinking that they saw the book as an antidote, that it was almost like a flu shot. If you read these moral stories to their kids, they might be insulated against Beavis and Butthead and rap and all these dread evils that are lurking out there and threatening to overwhelm them.
But also, I mean, and Bill Bennett sat in that chair a couple years ago, talk about this book.
I'm sure.
Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, and Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln, and lots of other folks are quoted at great length in that book.
Well, I'm seizing on Bennett to make a point, and the publisher was right. It certainly has gotten a lot of attention in the line. And I think, ironically, a lot of people are paying attention to the book who might not have if it were simply another book about old and new media. But I do feel very strongly there are certainly positive values in that book, and I don't think any child can be harmed by reading it. But several things about it I find very disturbing. I find these were not stories that he wrote. They were stories he edited and sanitized in many cases, changed. and they don't help kids who are in need. They are not an antidote to culture. They may be great books to buy in their own right and quite fun and useful to have, but the idea that they are in some way going to protect needy children or insulate other kinds of kids from poisonous messages in culture are wrong. And I think as long as parents keep buying this, they're not facing up to the real issues of the digital age.
This is a magazine that you have something to do with here.
I'm the media critic therein.
Wired magazine. Who owns it?
It's Louis Rossetto, Wired Ventures.
Where's it based?
San Francisco.
What's the audience like?
I think it's younger audience. It's very eclectic. It's from my email, I would say a lot of kids, a lot of people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. You know, the cyber movement in a way was started by hippies from the 60s, so there are a lot of middle-aged people involved in it. Probably the largest block would be, I say, in their professionals, their 20s and 30s, people who are connected to advertising, media, younger, pretty affluent group. I call them the digital nation.
And how much of your life depends on that magazine?
A small chunk. I write a column for their website called Media Rant on Hotwired, and I'm a contributing editor to the magazine. But I also write mysteries and novels, and this is my first nonfiction book, and I'm doing another also for Random House.
What's the other one going to be about?
It's going to be about morality, ironically. It's called Magnetic North. It's sort of picking up a little bit where Thomas Merton left off. Not that I'm comparing myself to him.
And this cover, who's on this cover? Who are these photographs of?
These were the designers from, actually from Hotwired. You know, my website is my column. I have a column, and in the keeping with the spirit of the digital world, these great artists at Hotwired come up with this art every day making fun of me and lampooning my column. And that was artwork they came up with to make fun of one of my columns about morality and media. The idea was invoking the 50s and parents' need for a sort of more wholesome image. You see they're looking at a laptop there.
And are these, is this I can't tell from looking at the photograph, are they all together there in that photograph?
Yeah, all together.
And then the laptop's right below, but it's not, with that superimposed on it?
Yeah.
Let's look at your website. How do people find this, by the way? You can see it up on the screen.
They go to www.hotwired.com. It's on the Hotwired website, which is Wired Magazine's website.
So you go originally to Wired Magazine's website?
No, you go to Hotwired. It's called Hotwired.
Hotwired.
www.hotwired.com.
You write about Netizen in the book. What is that?
Netizen is a political and media site on Hotwired that was set up to deal with the presidential campaign. I did the media criticism, was following the media coverage of the campaign. And it was an experiment. It was John Heilman, who writes from the New Yorker also, was doing the daily campaign political stuff, and I was doing media.
Let's look at, this is a column that was on 3 February, and you say there is no more perverse, unpredictable, or idiosyncratic culture than this one. Last week I wrote about my response to a column on Slate. Slate is
Michael Kinsley's web magazine, the one he left the New Republic to found for Microsoft.
In which my new book, Virtuous Reality, was triced, and I was, A, compared to the Unabomber, B, accused of consorting with violent film buffs, phone freaks, and web porn peddlers, and C, labeled St. John of cyberspace, and D, compared to Dave Garroway and Milton Berle.
See, my book has struck a nerve, and my publisher was right.
I was portrayed as brooding alone in the isolation of my basement, which the Slate writer Jack Schaefer said sounds like a clammy and frightening place to work. Now, how often do you write this column?
Oh, 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes when something's really going on, it might be more.
Who does that artwork right there?
The same artist who did the cover.
And what's that
Kevin
supposed to
and
be? That's your basement there.
This is the first time I've seen this, actually. I sent this off last night, so I haven't actually seen it. I think it's my basement. I think it's this is me emerging from the basement to go on my book tour.
How many people read your column a week?
I don't know exactly. I think about 250,000 people at least visit the site. And the column is also distributed by something called Pointcast to another 1 million people who can buy it or not on a daily basis.
Now, what were they talking about the basement in this book?
Well, the Virtuous Reality, as you mentioned, struck a nerve, and I think the Bennett line certainly helped that. And the fact that I poked the boomers pretty sharply.
By the way, what's the youngest boomer and what's the age range? I know I'm not one.
I think boomers is sort of a state of mind. I think it's really this
Maybe I am one.
I don't think you are one from having watched you for years. I think it's a state of mind which is at the moment very anxious and fearful about media and culture. I would say, you know, ranges from high 30s to mid 50s, but it could go up or down. It's a state of mind. I think it was. Some of them are the legacies of the 60s, these sort of idealists who were somewhat disenchanted with what happened. And some of it really comes from the fearfulness of the boomers who are very anxious parents. I think.
So,
I would say Slate would be a boomer place because Slate, Michael Kinsley, came to the web. He left Washington. He left the New Republic to start this magazine, which he said was going to civilize the web. He was going to bring literacy and sort of Washington standards of media to the sort of unruly net culture. And one of his writers, I think this was a review of my book, kind of had a burst of blood vessel and compared me to the Unabomber because he had heard somehow. I mean, the idea that anybody would hear about my basement in Washington is a kick to me. That I write in my basement, which is certainly true. Although I don't brood alone. I have 2 yellow labs that I brood with, and they didn't like the book. And they were very. I think the real criticism of the book was that I was making victims out of. The writer felt I was making computer users into victims of media phobia, and that they weren't victims; they were rich kids, and web porn peddlers and phone freaks.
So they really had at you. I mean, we could show you what the Slate looks like.
Yes.
Those that go on the web. There it is, right there.
Right. Slate's a very good website. It's very smart.
But they really let you have it, though. Jack Schaefer did.
Yes, they did.
What about overall? What's been the reaction to your book?
It's been mixed. I think there was some really good review. USA Today was a great review. I think the boomers are not happy with the book. The Washington Post was pretty critical of it. I guess I haven't seen that many other. The LA Times was pretty critical of it. Booklist gave it a rave. USA Today gave it a rave. People love it or they hate it.
Where are you from originally?
Providence, Rhode Island.
How long did you live in Providence?
Till I was about 14.
Where'd you leave? What was the reason you left?
My family moved. We went to Atlantic City, where it was just before the age of gambling there.
What were your parents doing when they?
My father was the program development director of Big Brothers of America. He was a social worker. My mother was a housewife. And she's returned to Providence, and he's no longer alive.
And how many kids in the family?
There were 3. I have a brother who was in radio in Providence. And has,
Still?
No, he's now actually working in software development for healthcare companies. And my sister lives in Boston, and she's a computer programmer.
And you lived in Atlantic City for how long?
I lived there about 2 years. I just finished high school there. And then I went to George Washington University, which I was tossed out of. And then went to the New School for Social Research, which I was also tossed out of.
In New York?
Yeah.
But along the way, what were your interests?
Well, I was always interested in writing. I started working as a reporter, during the 60s for the Atlantic City Press. It was a great place to start. And I got to see this astonishing amount of media history. I got to saw the end of the golden age of newspapers. I ended up in television. I ended up in magazines. I have the distinction of having failed in all media, really, which makes me uniquely qualified, I think, to be a media critic, because I think I understand failure all too well. I had 2 newspapers die out from under me, and a magazine,
Which
and
one?
A TV show. The Baltimore News American, the Dallas Times Herald. The TV show was Phyllis George and the CBS Morning News.
And you were working at all those places when they failed?
No, I was gone from the newspapers, but I saw them sinking.
Now go back to the George Washington University story. Why'd you get bounced out of there?
I didn't go to class. I found it pretty uninteresting.
How old are you today?
I'm now 49. But I didn't interact well with school. It was never not a good medium for me. But I think in a way, I'm a believer in education. I don't mean to diminish it, but it was good for me because I didn't really know what I was supposed to think. So I feel like life for me is a continuous series of miracles, as I get to learn things I didn't learn when I should have learned them. I think I read this great Einstein quote that he thought that people were of 2 kinds: people who believed everything was a miracle, people who believed nothing was a miracle. And I think all this stuff I'm involved with is miraculous, somewhat because I came to it late, and because I don't think I really know that I'm sometimes not supposed to like it.
Why'd you get bounced out of the New School?
Same reason. It was the 60s. I was working for the Liberation News Service and stopping the war.
Who owned the Liberation News Service?
It was a group of sort of radical, journalists and hippies who were, vanished. And I was a copy boy for the New York Times by day. And I had a secret life at night where I was a guerrilla reporter for LNS during the Columbia riots and all. But then I took a look at the Times, and I had my first intimation that I really wasn't cut out for corporate environments. And a lesson which I think took me a long time to actually really get. And I went to Atlantic City, where I had a great time as a reporter. It was a very corrupt place, and you could, we caught the public safety commissioner selling marijuana out of his parking lot. I was an investigative reporter, and went on to papers like the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Washington Post to be a reporter and editor, and had a lot of trouble with it. I never stayed at a place very long. I was very happy when I was writing and reporting, and very unhappy when I was promoted and got to be a boss. and had real trouble with that. And then gave that up. Finally got that that was not the path for me.
So what year were you here at the Washington Post?
It was during the Watergate stuff, when my legend there was the city editor came over to me and said there was a break-in at the Watergate. He had a sense there was a really good story. Was I interested? And I said, nah. Seems like a burglary. I wasn't interested.
Serious about this?
Yeah.
You said no.
I said no. I don't, it seems like a burglary to me.
Did he go off then to Carl
Yes,
Bernstein?
went up to Bernstein and Woodward. I did some of the early stories with them, you know, but they both, especially Woodward, the second he heard about it, he just lit up. I remember that night quite vividly because I saw what a magnificent reporter he was innately, because he just started drooling over the story the minute he heard about it. And I thought, who would want to go pursue some dumb burglary at the Democratic Party? And he immediately, he just smelled that there was something there. He just knew it. And the two of them went off, you know, very happily and eagerly about it. But that was a fork in the road for me. How
long were you at the Post?
So about 8 or 9 months. I did not like Washington. It was not a comfortable place for me. I have this very romanticized notion of journalists, that they really should be outsiders, that they were meant to be outsiders. And Washington, of course, they're the ruling party. And I think journalists should be outside looking at parties, and here they were always giving them. And it just, and they didn't, also in Washington, you don't ever get to cover stories. You get to cover people talking about stories. So there's this level of disconnection about everything, that a story in Washington is, you know, what the Secretary of State might or might not be saying or doing or thinking. But there were really actually very few stories. So I went to the Philadelphia Inquirer, which Gene Roberts was then sort of revamping, and covered Frank Rizzo in the police department, and had a blast, had a great time. It was probably my happiest journalistic experience.
How long were you there?
About 3 or 4 years, 4 years then.
Now, along the way you married.
Right.
What year?
It was the same year, the year I declined to be part of the Watergate team.
And who did you marry?
Paula Spann, who is in fact a reporter for the Washington Post. And she covers New York for the style section.
And Emma, you said, is now 15 years old. When did you go to work for CBS?
I went to work for CBS when, let's see, I guess the Dallas Times-Herald began falling apart. And somebody at CBS had the bright idea of bringing a print person into television and seeing if these values couldn't graft onto TV.
How old are you at this point?
This point, I probably, well, it was only 7 or 8 years ago, really. It was the late 80s. And I read in the paper one where they'd hired Phyllis George to be my co-anchor in the morning on the morning news. And that, of course, led to my writing career as the program sort of collapsed. It was hilarious, not at the time, but it was not a place where I should ever have been, really. And not a place I adapted to well or really belonged in. And it was very good for me in a lot of ways. I got to travel all over the world. I was there the last year that CBS News really had money to spend. And so we did things like we went to London with the whole program for a week. We didn't have a budget. We had no idea what it cost. This would be unimaginable now. And I saw, actually, I was only there for 1 year where the old news culture was very evident. CBS News was a remarkable institution. It was probably the greatest information gathering institution ever. You know, there were researchers, everybody cared deeply about facts and about nuance and about accuracy. If you made a mistake, it was a dreadful shame. People were just mortified about it. If a story broke, researchers and producers would appear from all over the place to brief you on it and tell you about it and talk to you about it. And it was sad to see that culture dismantled so ruthlessly, because if you weren't there, it's very hard to look at it and see how much is missing. And if you were there, and you see that they never send anybody anywhere anymore, and that there is none of this sort of depth, it's too bad. It's a loss. It's sort of unmourned loss. And I am amazed. I was amazed then. I'm amazed now that this institution, which was so vital to American politics for so many years, was brutally dismantled without a peep from the public or really from even journalism.
Why do you think that happened?
I think in the 80s, just when this downsizing merger takeover mania came, corporations scarfed up most of American media and homogenized all of it and downsized everybody. I think reporters were asleep at the switches, because many Americans have been getting laid off for years, and at phone companies and at GM and other places. It wasn't much of a story then. The term downsizing really became a big story when it started happening to reporters, at which point it was too late, really. It didn't become a moral issue. But I was surprised, and I think it's somewhat of a symptom of this disconnection that we talk about, that the country sort of blinked and didn't pay much attention when CBS News was really disemboweled. It really was a loss, I think. And I feel this perspective, which has really shaped a lot of my writing in media. I saw newspapers begin to stumble, and I saw CBS News dismantle. And I had these intimations very strongly when I I was sort of exiled on the show onto a floor with Bill Moyers, and who was also in exile. And we did a documentary together, which was great fun. And then he left, and I was alone on this floor. And the man with the coffee cart resigned, came to me and resigned because he had no one else to quit to. And I thought, he has a lot more vision than I have. And I left, and I'm sure they would have fired me, you know, any day. But as I began thinking about what to do with my life, I looked around media, and I saw this culture just in great distress, this declining culture. Newspapers were struggling, they weren't creative, they weren't vital, they weren't hiring. The television culture was being dismantled. And so I went off to write a novel, Sign Off, which reflected some of those experiences. And then went on to do a mystery series. And I started doing media criticism because everybody wanted the inside dirt on CBS, which I didn't have and never really wrote about. But that's what got magazines calling me. They all called me up and said, you know, we really love an insider. What's Dan Rather really like? And then I started, and my editor at 7 Days then went to Rolling Stone, and he hired me as a media critic there. And I took to it. I felt this is really, you know, what I was meant to do. Because I'd seen so much transition, and because I had such a feeling for it, of all the change that was coming. And one day in 1991, he called me up and said, you got to get a modem and you got to get online. I said, why would I want to do that? And he said, because if you don't, you're not going to have much to write about in 3 or 4 years. And this is going to be very exciting. This is going to be really very important. And you got to get a modem. And I whined and fussed and resisted and didn't want to do it. And he did make me, Eric Etheridge. In fact, the book is dedicated to him.
Who is Eric Etheridge?
He is now, he's now running a Microsoft website in New York called Sidewalk. But he was the first editor of George and was my editor at Rolling Stone, and before that at 7 Days. And the dedication, in fact, I said every writer should be so lucky as I was. It's a great editor. But he made me, by force of will, go out and buy a modem and wire up. And this is this feeling of being newly educated, or perhaps uneducated would be a more honest way to put it. I was just reborn. I felt, after all this decline I had seen, and fatigue, and cynicism in journalism, it was a gateway. I walked through this new world where people were free and outspoken and forming new kinds of communities and creating new kinds of culture. And he was right. It gave me a whole new life as a writer, because I've had a blast writing about it ever since. It is the antithesis of the traditional media world. It is free and it's outspoken, it's vibrant. There's a real passion for liberty there that you don't hear much about in regular newsrooms.
You said that when CBS lost its primacy or whatever, no one cared. Where do you find people care passionately about anything in the media today?
On the internet. Freedom lives on the web. I mean, it sounds corny to say it, and I would be embarrassed to say it, I think, in most newsrooms. But there's a passion for freedom, a spirit of freedom, that is breathtaking on the web.
Stop for a moment and try to explain this to someone who's never had a computer in their hands, doesn't even know what the web looks like. And do you have numbers, by the way? How many people literally are on the web in this country when they want to be? What's the number?
There are a few reliable. On the web, probably about 12% of Americans. Probably about 50% or 60%
So
Americans.
roughly 30 million people?
30, well, again, if you throw in work plus college, probably I'd say 40 million, 45 million at some point have some access.
Is there an age group there and there that more often than not?
Well, of course, the web is a particularly young culture, but the fastest growing part of the net culture is actually older people. So it's really, which most people don't know. I mean, the net is described mostly in terms of its pornographic dangers, but the miraculous things that go on there have nothing to do with sex. They have a lot to do with old people connecting for the first time, and kids getting online, and new kinds of spiritual communities are just probably the biggest thing going there, plus businesses. But there are two terms that people use. There's the internet, which is the whole computer link culture, by which people connect to one another by modems all over the world. And there's the web, which is a series of graphically linked sites, of which Hotwired is one. And what characterizes a website from just simply an internet place is this linkage, that Medium has never been linked like that before. Where my website, if I mention William Bennett, for example, he'll have a line underneath his name. If you click on his name, you'll go to his book. It's just intensely interactive in the sense that you cross-reference everything you're talking about. So that this idea of linkage is very important. These sites are also profoundly interactive. You know, when I did a column for Rolling Stone or for New York Magazine, when I wrote the column, I was done. My work was over. I had told my truth and I was gone. Writing on the web, the column is just the beginning of this process where you are, you interact.
Here's another column of yours. It's called Channeling Mencken. When was this on? Do you know? I guess it was in December. So you can go back and you can call this up from your old column.
It's archived. You can go back anytime. And you notice at the if you can go down to the very end of the column, and you see H.L. Mencken's name is underlined. If you click on that, you go to a H.L. Mencken website.
There he is.
There he is. And you would do the same thing if it was William Bennett. Even though I might criticize William Bennett, if you click on his name, you can find out more about him. You can even buy his book, and there is Mr. Bennett again.
You can buy his book?
Well, you can order it, sure. Sure. I mean, the idea that, one of the big ideas about this kind of writing, if you go to the very bottom, you'll see a thing called threads. There's 3 ways in which the reader can respond to this column. There's threads, and below that there's email John, and below that there's email the netizen, and I think below that there's even one more. Maybe wrong. I think it's those 3. Those are the 3. So you can email me and say I'm a jerk, which is what basically Threads is for. You can email me personally and tell me I'm a jerk, or you can email Netizen and tell them that I'm a jerk, and or you can even agree with me, which a lot of people do. So I would get, depending on the column, anywhere from 100, 200, sometimes 500 or 600 messages. And a key element of this column is that people can respond to me. They can tell me they disagree with me. They can tell me I'm being too hard on William Bennett, or that I'm not being fair. They can ask me to reconsider my point of view. So a column becomes a living organism. The column becomes not a static thing that you simply drop as an op-ed page would be dropped. It becomes an idea that that goes out into the world and is the beginning of a great dialogue.
Are you one of those people that yells at the television set?
No, only once.
But I mean, when you watch, do you watch much television?
Not too much, a little bit.
But do you find it satisfying at all, anytime?
Yes, I do. I like the X-Files a lot.
What about the news business, though?
I tend to turn to cable much more. I have to say, I would watch C-SPAN. I will watch, Politically Incorrect sometimes. I like programs with more attitude. I might wheel into C-SPAN to see some breaking news, but I have to say I like programs that are interactive. I thought I was very influenced by the callers on C-SPAN. It was because I get a lot of email like that.
Where do you feel? I mean, you have often the reaction that this is what this is about. You know what I'm talking about, where you say that people feel most passionate about the internet. And at what moment do you sit there and say, this is why I'm in this?
I think I wrote about Thomas Paine on the internet and Wired, and I write about him in the book, of course.
And you've got this lovely picture. What is this?
That's Thomas Paine at a keyboard, as envisaged by...
Is that really... No, he died.
Close. It's not exactly. It's him in the 4, not in the back.
Yeah.
Looks like Charles Lawton in the back. But I basically said in the book that Thomas Paine, if he were alive today, would be on the internet. That's where he would be writing. Because he couldn't get a job at any newspaper in America, because he certainly did not believe in objectivity. And he was far too outspoken and independent-minded to work in a newsroom. And he would not have liked corporate media in the least. So I think his spirit is very much alive there. We are very free on the internet. We can really say things you can't say in traditional media. We can question the existence of God if we wish. We can go beyond the sort of narrow confines of liberalism and conservatism. Elderly people are forming these remarkable communities like SeniorNet on America Online, where the grief conference on SeniorNet is the single most powerful thing I've ever seen in media, where people go when they've experienced a death or when they feel they're about to die. You can't go on that topic without crying. There's a great sense of liberty there where people use language they want. Now, sometimes I don't mean to be a cheerleader. There's a lot about this culture that is unpleasant, that is confusing, that is expensive, that is difficult, that is raucous and hostile. And, it's not a paradise. It invokes much of the spirit of early American media, in that it is very outspoken and very loud and very opinionated, sometimes so much so that it's difficult to work in it.
Does it ever get under your skin?
Yes, sure.
I mean, when they fire back at you?
Sometimes. I mean, I have really evolved quite a bit, I think, in the last year. The reason I love being an interactive columnist as opposed to the other kind is you really never stop being challenged, ever. There's no point at which you're done. with any idea. I mean, I wrote I was mentioning the Thomas Paine column I mentioned, I wrote in Wired. One of the things about Paine is that his bones were stolen. Nobody knows where his bones are. So I wrote this piece for Wired magazine about Paine and what a great person he was and how much I admired him, and that his bones were gone. And so this was about a year or so ago. So every month or so I get an email from someone in England who has a piece of him.
Really?
Well, Lady Huffington. I don't know how these people get my column. I can't imagine that they're online. They're usually titled, and they'll email that they like my piece very much, and they know where his femur is, or his jawbone, or his rib cage. And I really think by the end of the year I'm going to have him all reassembled, little bits of him in England. Now this is good. I didn't even know the process by which this idea moves through the world. You know, I think it moves from computers. Sometimes people print it out. Sometimes people will mail it to someone. Sometimes people will email it to someone. But this idea is still very much alive. I had an experience this year where I wrote a sort of hyperbolic column about Tupac Shakur, the rapper, a very controversial rapper, who died. And I've often defended rap in some of my media writings as being, you know, overly demonized by mainstream media. And I wrote a column about Shakur that was probably not as sensitive as it should have been about the violence he was involved in, or about some of the misogyny in his language. So I was utterly trashed. I mean, I must have had 2,000 messages telling me what a jerk I was and how insensitive I was and giving me how offended. And it isn't that you have a referendum on all your work, but you can tell by the tenor of the response when you have misfired. And people were very upset by what I had written. I had offended people. I had really been insensitive to this other part of him. And so I wrote a second column saying, you know what, I overstated the case. There are things about him that I like, but I really should have been more careful. Then I got another whole blast from African-American college kids who love him and who are on these websites, and college websites, and kids I'd not often heard from. And they said, wait a minute, you were right the first time. You know, he really was coming around. He's a good writer. He was moderating a lot of his images. You know, you should have defended him. Thank you for defending him. Don't take it back. And then I thought, well, all right, here's another reality. And then another wave came in from academics and people in the music industry and lyricists and songwriters saying, well, wait a minute, you know, here's the truth about Tupac Shakur. You know, he was becoming a much better writer, and his music was beginning to moderate, and he also did some offensive things. The truth, as it often is in the middle. So I did a third column, finally, which was really the one I should have written in the first place. And I said, you know what, I've had all this information from all of these people, and here's what I now think. And in the meantime, there were these public areas, which we call threads, where all of these people were able to jump on and argue and disagree and share information and change perspectives. And I don't feel like I have to be right and stick to my guns if I'm convinced that I'm wrong, and if people take the trouble to email me. The most frightening email to me is not from the hostile people who insult me, which you can sort of dismiss. It's from people who know what they're talking about. I mean, it's terrifying to get email from a dean of a college who's been studying a subject for 25 years, who really lays you out and says, you know, you didn't read this book and you didn't read that book. But the net effect of it is it makes me better. It makes me smarter. It makes me learn. It keeps me growing in a way that I don't feel is easy for journalists to do, and they need to do.
Let me go back to this chapter we showed earlier on Thomas Paine. You say he was born in 1737, died in 1809, moved to the United States when he was 37 years old, and wrote how many books?
Well, he wrote essays, really. He sort of and he inspired me in the form of this book, which is a polemic. He wrote this sort of thing. I'm not comparing myself to him. He wrote Common Sense, which was the country's first bestseller.
And you gave the figures on how many...
It's 500,000. He sold 500,000 copies of Common Sense in a country with 2 million people in it. And he wouldn't take royalties for it because he was afraid people wouldn't be able to afford it. It's one of the reasons he died a pauper. And then when he was thrown in jail in France, he wrote The Rights of Man. He wrote The Age of Reason. He wrote 3 or 4, I think, of the classic essays on individual liberty. And he created political journalism with Common Sense, which was really the first statement like that for individual liberty in North America, for sure. Some of his ideas were drawn from some of the British writers, but he was a best-selling writer. He did pamphlets, really. He did long, argumentative essays. And I use him as an example of why I don't like objectivity very much, because if Thomas Paine were subscribing to the conventions of objectivity, Common Sense would have begun with, you know, a spokesperson for the British says the colonies should remain attached, and a spokesperson for the colonists says it shouldn't, and we'd still probably be part of the empire.
I think we have not much to see here, but that's from, is that your piece in Wired?
Yes, it is. Great work.
And it's on the web.
I didn't know that, but it was news
You
to me.
did not know that?
I didn't. Maybe that's where they're getting. Maybe that's where all these British people are seeing it.
Go back to Thomas Paine. New Rochelle, New York figures in his life. What's
Yes.
up there now?
Well, his house. There's a little Thomas Paine museum, which is sort of a funky little place.
You've been there?
Yeah, many times. And there's a hole in the ground where his grave was, where this pamphleteer, who didn't like his work, just grabbed his bones and scrolled them off to England on a boat, where they just vanished. No one really knows what happened to them. He ended up sort of a wretched and disliked figure. He was obnoxious. He was extremely opinionated, and had a gift for alienating his friends, and was always whining about money, as writers still do today. But those three essays, The Age of Reason, The Rights of Man, Common Sense, they really gave birth to the modern American media, to the idea of media as a force for change, to the idea of reasoned argument, and for the use of media as a guide to help us sort out some of the moral dilemmas that we have. I mean, it's a reason why virtuous reality is cast in such an argumentative way, because it's a polemic. In our time, it's somewhat shocking to people who go, how can you say these things? You know, how can you be so argumentative? Why aren't you being more reasoned, more balanced, more researched? The boomers in particular, or some of the reviewers have said that.
Your book is 201 pages long.
Right.
Short compared to a lot of books that are
I think so.
put out.
Short or so.
And it sells for $21.
Right.
Whose idea was it to keep it short?
Well, it was never my idea to write short in any medium. My editor was very, very determined to keep it short, because she actually was picked up on the Thomas Paine idea and said, you know, this book should be a polemic. This is what you're good at. You're good at making arguments about media. So make an argument about media. Don't go out and interview 2,000 researchers and quote 500 studies, and just make the argument. But the polemic form of essay, which is the one that American media was invented upon, is so shocking that I notice many of the reviewers don't even know what it is. And some of the reviews say, well, why didn't Ketz go out and talk to hundreds of children? Why didn't he quote experts and deans and researchers? The idea of an argument is almost unknown in media, because you can only do it on these op-ed pages, and even then within a very militantly moderate context. And the idea that I think drove me, in fact, in many ways to write the book, much more than even Mr. Bennett, is the notion of a media that has lost this moral mooring, lost this connection with this man, who worked very hard on his essays, researched them very carefully, filled them with facts, as I've certainly tried to do, and then made very reasoned arguments.
Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine. The arguments were, you know, here's my opinion, I'm upfront about it, here's how I reach my opinion, here are statistics to support my opinion. Take it or leave it. And, of course, that argument gave birth not only to media, but to the American Revolution.
Look what Barclay Kern has found on the web now.
Well, that I have seen.
And can you also get the other two
Yes.
books, The Rights of Man?
Yeah, there are a dozen Thomas Paine websites. There's some in England and there's some here. And Paine followers, not a large number of them. All his works are available there, the biography, story of his life. People come together and talk about freedom in the press on these sites.
How long was he in prison?
Well, in France, he wasn't in prison very long. I think less than about a year. And he was supposed to be executed. He was earmarked for the guillotine. And some friends of his marked the door in such a way that the guards would be fooled, and they passed him by. He went over there to help the revolution, the French Revolution, but he ended up being critical of them for being so brutal. This was a person who had a gift for provocation and for being in trouble wherever he went. But for me, he has always embodied the spirit of American media as it was meant to be. And I think the loss of that spirit is crippling for journalism. Whether you're a liberal or a conservative, I think we're deprived of this sort of informed and passionate reason.
We found something called the Thomas Paine Historical, I know they go back to, yeah, here it is,
That's the Historical Society. That's the one in New Rochelle.
Many people belong to this?
Not a lot. I belong to it. It's in New Rochelle.
There's the house.
There's the house, Thomas Paine Cottage. And the museum is right up the hill from it. And it has some artifacts like his spectacles and some of his writing instruments.
What do you think he would be like to be as a friend?
I think he'd be hard. He'd be tough. He didn't have a lot of friends.
Why not?
He was very grumpy. He was very opinionated. He had a notion, for example, that no one should ever edit him. He's very quarrelsome.
Let me read what you wrote in your book about Thomas Paine. You said he could easily have had the cast of McLaughlin and Company or Crossfire in mind when he wrote "The wretch who will write on any subject for bread or in any service for pay stands equally in rank with the prostitute who lets out her person. Why do you think that he would have been writing about McLaughlin and Company and Crossfire with those words?
I think the evolution of the Washington breed of combat journalism is the absolute antithesis of American journalism and its promise and its spirit. The idea that these people go on television every week for money to pretend to be passionate on both sides of every issue is appalling.
Are they pretending, in your opinion?
Well, they have the same, they have to be right or they have to be left, so they can't change their mind.
But how does that track with you said that you love journalists who are opinionated and you love polemics?
Because I think they're not, you don't have a journalist arguing a point of view. You have journalists who are paid to argue the same point of view every week and pretend to be passionate about it. It's the opposite of reason. It's what it is sort of like a cockfight every week, where people get together and debate each other and score points on each other. And it's one of the reasons Americans are so alienated from media, because these people aren't coming on sincerely with opinion. They're really morally trying to persuade you around to a point of view. You're taking money to appear to be passionate every week. And it's a particular damaging for Washington journalists to be doing that, because we probably need them more now to be clear than we've ever needed them. There's so much information coming at us from so many different quarters. Instead of helping us, I mean, what Thomas Paine, I think, would have done is said, you know, here's what we should think about Bill Clinton, and here's why I think so. Or here's what we should do about welfare, and here's why I think so. And we could do it or not. We don't have to take his point of view.
You said that Thomas Paine would be reclusive and moody, too obnoxious and combative to have dinner with Bill and Hillary Clinton.
Yes, no.
And you go on to say that he would refuse book deals from Rupert Murdoch and flee in horror at offers from Washington talk shows. Are you worried that you'll get caught up in this kind of a world? Because
I certainly already am.
I mean, give me an example. Here's the,
yes.
as you would say, the old media. That let me see what the date was on this. January the 19th. This is you got the lead. Is this an excerpt from your book?
It's an excerpt.
You got the lead in Arts and Leisure.
Yeah, that's great.
Establishment.
Yes, very much.
Katz.
I was quite stunned, by the way. People thought that picture was me, but it wasn't.
Why do you think the New York Times would? I mean, you're not very friendly in here to today's newspapers.
Well, I am and I'm not. I mean, one of the points where the book lands is on this notion that the idea that one culture must triumph over the other is false. I mean, I don't believe that old media is going to destroy new media, or that new media is going to destroy old media. I think in 10 years we're going to be sitting here for having this conversation again. We're still going to be looking at newspapers. I'm still going to want to have excerpts in them. We're still going to, you know, Wired magazine itself is most influential in print form. More books were sold last year in America than ever before. I just don't buy this notion that one culture is going to blow the other away. I think sensible people, which is the point of that excerpt and probably why they liked it, sensible people will make sensible choices. They will pick and choose from each media what works for them. They don't have to choose. You don't have to ever be on the World Wide Web, and you can lead a very happy life and very fulfilling. But the fact that the World Wide Web exists doesn't threaten your existence, or mean that civilization is coming to an end, or that waves of pornography are rolling over our children. I think the Times actually picked the most sensible and restrained part of the book, which is fine. And I am absolutely dealing with it. I doubt that Paine would be making the compromises I'm making on a book tour. You know, I had this. I went on NPR Talk of the Nation yesterday, and there was one of these sort of TV talk show gladiators there to sort of do battle with me. And I thought to myself, well, you know, I didn't think of Thomas Paine, but it's definitely part of a hype. If you want to write a book in America today, you can't get a book published. You can't get your point of view across if you are as pure as Thomas Paine was. Or maybe I'm just kidding myself. Maybe if I were really true to his spirit, I would.
What do you think of the V-chip?
I think it's a fraud. I think, like a lot of this sort of censorship technology, it's not going to do what people think it's going to do. And I think Bill Clinton is being as opportunistic as William Bennett is in advancing it as a safe device for dealing with television. There are about 800,000 hours of TV programming a week on television. And, you know, very few Americans can work a VCR yet. To ask these sort of hard-pressed parents to sort of V-chip the TV every week is crazy. It's ludicrous. I mean, even if it worked, which it won't, you know, it's not even required for the TV station. It's voluntary for the networks to even rate these programs. It'll be 30 or 40 years before it's in any substantial number of American homes. It costs $100 or so to get. It's just not going to be a factor in our lives. And I think for the president to advance this as as yet another substitute for being responsible for your kids. You know, he has to know, as William Bennett has to know, that this stuff isn't going to do the trick. It's going to take money out of people's pockets, but it's not going to make their kids' lives safer or better, which is my whole argument. I could have easily have put Bill Clinton's name on that cover.
You say in another part of your book, ditto for network news, which needs to stop blowing millions on anchors' salaries and experiment with format sets and styles. You saw this whole thing up close when you were at CBS Morning News.
Yeah.
Didn't Phyllis George, did she make a lot of money? And wasn't she
did make a
important?
lot of money. I think the...
Is she important to that, making that show work?
Well, it didn't work, which is one of the reasons I'm writing. But that's a great example when you talk about television of how commercial broadcasting has, in a news sense, has gone down with the ship. In retaining this anchor culture, which is incredibly expensive, you have these anchors are making millions and millions of dollars a year, essentially, to read 5 minutes of introductions to other people's work 5 times a week. It's like 40 minutes of work a week, for which they make $4, $5, $6 million. And some of them, they're all quite smart. You know, it's not a question of their being, you know, dumb. But what's the point? What function does an anchor serve? When Walter Cronkite or Edward R. Murrow did it, anchors had a very important function, which was to make news respectable. It was a new medium, and people were nervous about it. And Paley and others were smart enough to get these extremely respectable-looking people and put them up front to make television safe, which is probably something the internet should do and probably ease a lot of this phobia. But they don't have a function anymore, really. You know, and they've been completely bypassed. News has moved to cable, and it's moved online, but mostly it's moved to cable, which is where news really lives on television now. I'm very struck in the book and elsewhere at the resistance of newspapers and commercial broadcasting to change. That if you look at a newscast and you go back 40 years and look at a newscast then, you're going to see almost the same form, the same, you know, middle-aged person sitting there, you know, in a suit, reading introductions to other people's stories, even though the entire spectrum of information, the way people move, when they get home, what they do when they get home, women being at home, all of that has changed profoundly. And yet the network news format hasn't changed a bit. And that's true of newspapers too, by the way. If you look at the format of a paper, if you went back 50 years ago, you might see a little more color now, and there might be a little more white space. But the basic format of a newspaper is still unchanged in half a century, despite the fact that everything about news, the way it moves, the way people use it, has changed radically. And I think the problem is one of creativity, not technology. I don't think the problem with newspapers or network news is that no one cares about them. The problem is they've just become fossilized. They won't change.
Earlier we talked about Emma, your daughter. Has she read your book?
No. No, she really just keeps a distance from some of this stuff. She reads a lot of books. But she's heard, as she says, I've heard it. She might get around to it. She reads my fiction. But the serious discussions about old and new media, I think, are probably not up her alley. Although she might.
What's your best example of old media?
Well, I mean, I think CBS News would be one. I think the New York Times, the Washington Post.
And what's your best example of new media?
I think cable. It's probably the very adroit, you know, cable news channels would be one I would say, are probably new media that has reached into the mainstream more powerfully than any other. Certainly the World Wide Web is coming on, but it's nowhere near a mainstream media yet.
You, in the beginning, acknowledge a bunch of folks, including Paula Spann and Emma Spann, in this long list. But at the bottom, I.F. Stone, A.J. Liebling, Thomas Paine, Francis Bacon, and John Locke. We talked a little bit about Thomas Paine. Why I.F. Stone?
He personified to me this sort of outsider journalist whose breed has sort of vanished. Now, he's often used, people often invoke his name. But I think the thing about Stone that was very interesting was not so much his politics, but the fact that he kept himself very much outside the system and wrote about it with relentless integrity. At the same time, he knew a lot about it.
Did you know him?
No.
Never met him?
Never met him.
How about A.J. Liebling?
Never met him, certainly. But
and who was he?
He was a media critic, wrote for The New Yorker, and he, I think, to me, is a metaphor for the breed of media criticism that vanished, really, with him. Because media criticism is really no longer about criticizing the media. It's about knowing the people in the media well enough to get them on the phone and nibble on their ears. I think this idea of content criticism of media pretty much died with Liebling.
What about Francis Bacon?
Well, Bacon, I think, was the source of this essay that I drew from often. He was an inspiration to people like Paine and others in the Enlightenment. He had this idea of a more rational media. He had this idea of controlling technology to make greater sense out of issues. He had these sort of interesting utopian visions. But he was an influence on the people that I like and read, and on me too.
Finally, John Locke.
Well, John Locke, I had this great idea that I used in The Rights of Children for a healthier relationship between people who govern and those who are governed. And it was his ethic, the consent of the governed, that informed this idea I had about finding a more rational way to deal with kids about culture. That a social contract, which was Locke's idea, that government was a social contract between people and the people who govern them. And if anybody mishandled or misused their power or misbehaved, the contract was broken. And to me, this made enormous sense. I mean, I did a piece for Wired called The Rights of Children, which ended up being a chapter in the book. It changed. But the idea being that instead of trashing children and accusing them of stupidity and censoring them and blocking them and driving them crazy, it's to sit down with responsible kids. These would be older kids, and hammer out a social contract that works for them and for you. For example, I have one really with Emma, in the sense that she does well in school, she has responsibilities around the house, and she's expected to sort of conduct herself in a safe and responsible way. As long as she does that, she has a lot of freedom over her culture. She can watch the TV shows she wants. She can go on the net and mind her own business. Excuse me. I think this idea of beginning a rational negotiation with kids makes a lot of sense to me, and I think it's much better than the current system.
By the way, did you ever get that college degree?
No.
So how much time you got to go before you could get it?
Just about 4 years, I think. I think I went to 2 classes. Actually, though, I did write to George Washington University some years later and said, you know, I was in Washington, I was working at the Post, and I said, I'd like to come back and finish. And they wrote back saying, well, I don't know, you hardly went to any classes, and what about it? But we'll take you back. But I couldn't do it.
John Katz is the author of this book, and the subtitle, I've got to read it here, is How America Surrendered Discussion of Moral Values to Opportunists, Nitwits, and Blockheads Like William Bennett. And the name of the book is Virtuous Reality. John Katz, our guest.
Thank you.